my roommate in his Cat in the Hat costume. It was the 1st of November and he was still wearing it. Our party was on the 29th of October and it was funny then. Hell, even on the 30th it still made me laugh when I saw him occasionally creep out of his room to stock up on snacks from the kitchen. When I left the house for my 9 a.m. class on the 31st, and he was sitting in the kitchen in his Cat in the Hat costume still on, well, then I began to worry. John was quiet at the best of times, not too many friends, and I wasn't a stranger to sitting in silence at meal times. This was different though. His unnerving smile was all I could really see of his face beneath his prosthetics and makeup. It didn't help that it was a shitty homemade costume either. Visible stitching and discolored tufts of fur made it all the creepier. Our other flatmate had dropped out at the start of the semester, so it was just John and I for a long time. He wasn't inherently a weird guy before this either. Quiet, yes, but friendly enough. "Don't you have classes to go to?" I asked as I left for work on the 2nd. He silently shook his head, not looking up from the book he was reading. "Starting to get a real fucking creepy feeling around here, man," I muttered loud enough for him to hear as I shut the door behind it. "I like it." I heard John bark with venom from the driveway. It was the night of the 3rd when I finally cracked and phoned his sister. The white patches of the soup were beginning to yellow and there was an awful stench permeating around the house. She thought I was kidding at first, but after I explained in detail what had been going on the last few days, she went quiet. She assured me that he had been texting her regularly as he did, but he never got around to mentioning the costume. I'd known the guy for a little over a year at this point, but I didn't really know that much about him. His sister told me that he had been obsessed with Cat in the Hat after he had seen the movie in the cinema when he was around 8 or 9, but grew out of that phase fairly quickly. She assured me that she'd phone him and get to the bottom of whatever the hell was going on. It was this smell that woke me up. That's how pungent it was. "Don't meddle me with my affairs," John said, standing in the doorway with the dim light behind him which partially illuminated that fucking costume. "What the hell? Get out of here, you freak," I shouted in a panicked daze. "Don't meddle me with my affairs," he said again. His tone was calm, but there was a definite aggression behind it. He lingered there for a few more seconds, a silent tension between us. It was one of the few times in my life I'd ever felt genuine terror as I gazed at that horrendous cat costume and my roommate beneath it. The next day in class, I was going through my options in my head. My other friends had recommended calling the cops and that John was in need of some serious help. I didn't want to get him into some kind of trouble though, maybe even sanctioned. My choice was made for me when the 2 police detectives pulled me out of the lecture. They sat me down in the cafeteria with a stern look upon their faces. My first thought was that John had killed himself. I didn't know why, but that made the most sense to me at the time. I was dead wrong. "Why didn't you report that he was missing? Did you not find it odd for him to not come?" one quizzed me. He is missing? He should be there right now. Probably still wearing that stupid costume." A dog walker had discovered John's naked body in the bushes not too far from my house. The police reckoned he had been dead since the night of the 29th. They never found anyone in the house during their search, only that tattered costume which had been neatly folded on the top of my bed. Miss Marnie's Tea House. "You're going to hell, child of Satan. You'll burn in agony just like the Jews and heads. God will cast thee down to Gehenna. Burn, witch." That's how I used to begin my morning. Every morning. I live in the same little townhouse that my mother lived in, and her mother before her. And for as long as I can remember, we've lived next to Miss Thompson, who is perhaps the nastiest person I've ever met. Her voice has assaulted my ears since childhood. Either she was yelling at my mother or antagonizing me while I played outside. I don't know how she came to the conclusion that we're witches, but no matter how kind we were to her, her words were always the same. Die, burn in hell, Satan spawn, witches, bitches. So every morning I'd walk to my car amid her screaming and try to tune it out as I prepared for the day. After all, it's no good coming into work at a tea house when you're stressed. Your foul mood will poison the tea. At least, that's what my mother always taught me. Just like our home, the tea house had been in my family for generations. It is owned and managed by a woman, and we never take employees. They just aren't really needed. Besides, it's hard to teach a newcomer the finer points of tea making. Me? I've been studying tea since I was a child, as my mother passed down her secrets to me. It's a wonderful job, a wonderful life, and I quite enjoy it. All except for Miss Thompson, of course. Every morning at the tea house was the same. I began by rinsing out the cast iron teapot and teacups. You can't use soap on them, you know, and you can't wash the outside. You can only rinse them, and over time they'll take on the flavor of the teas you brew in them, which is why I have a separate tea set for each kind of tea. Green, black, yellow, oolong, white, and herbal infusions. I set the metal teapots down to brew hot water on the stove. You can't put cast iron on the stove either. While prepping the water, I'd select the teas I would feature that day. Of course, a customer can come in and request any kind of tea they like, but I always like to give my own recommendations. I would open the store at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'd spend the day serving tea. I had quite a few regulars come in that enjoyed the healing properties of tea. People with stomach problems who liked jade mint oolong, people with anxiety who preferred the chamomile blossom, and people who simply enjoyed the traditional taste and brewing process of matcha. Well, one morning, someone new came into the tea house. Someone I never expected to see. Jamie Thompson. Miss Thompson's grandson, who had spent most of his time caring for the aging crony, was standing in the front of my tea house, watching me serve mango black tea to a few elderly tourists looking for something sweet and strong. "Miss Marnie, I see your tea house is doing well," he began. I noticed the elderly woman I was helping out staring at him in open appreciation. He was quite handsome, even I must admit, but I ignored him and went back to tea preparation. Tea takes all of your attention, all of your heart. If you don't give it everything you got, it will fail you, because you've already failed yourself. Once the tea was prepared and the women were enjoying it iced, I stood up and approached the conspicuous newcomer. "Mr. Thompson, I take it? What can I get for you today?" Most of the time, I start by asking what a customer likes, what a customer needs, and what ailments are troubling them. I like to help people, but I was very wary of Jamie. Nothing good comes from a poisoned plant, after all. "Well, I'm actually here to get something for my grandmother. See, her mind is going. I read that tea is good for dementia, and I was wondering if you had any recommendations." It's true. Studies have shown that certain kinds of tea are good at preserving brain mass, but as of yet, nothing in modern medicine is miraculous enough to reverse dementia. Still, nature works in funny and great ways. I went behind the front counter to examine my selection of green teas. "You know, my grandmother, she probably wouldn't drink it if she knew that you had prepared it." I grunted in assent, none too keen on continuing our conversation. Jamie didn't seem to notice my reticence, or perhaps he just didn't care. "But you know, I'm hoping that maybe this will help patch things up between you. I think she'd really like you if she got to know you. I've always found you so fascinating." I selected some Gyokuro Imperial and turned to face him, appraising his expression. The light in his eyes told me that he was using his grandmother as a pretense to come see me. Oh. Ignoring his obvious interest, I prepared the tea leaves and rang up his purchase, explaining how they were best brewed and when to drink it for the best results. To his credit, he was very attentive, although he seemed more interested in my lips than the words coming out of them. "Well, thank you for this. I'll give it to my grandmother and come back to tell you the results." "There's no need to," I stated, anxious to get him out of my store, but he smiled in return, not a bit perturbed by my attitude. "Oh, you can't get rid of me that easily, Miss Marnie. I'll be back." With that, he turned and strode out of the store, the tourist still gawking at his tall, muscular frame. That was the start of all the trouble. Since that day, Jamie had started coming in regularly, always asking for my recommendations, always claiming that the tea we brewed helped his grandmother greatly. I seriously doubted that, but I didn't bother correcting his ignorance. After all, it was just a facade. At the close of each purchase, he would ask me the exact same question. "So, do you have any plans for the night?" Most of the time, I declined to answer. I had to admit, he was patient and persistent. He never missed a day. He was also sweet, in his own little way. He handed out compliments like candy, but only ever to me. Sometimes he brought in flowers, although I couldn't keep them in the store. The scent would taint the tea. He brought me sweets too, on occasion, and it was really getting on my nerves. Finally, one day he didn't immediately ask me out. Instead, he presented me with an opportunity, one that was too good to pass up. "Honestly, Marnie, I'll do anything you want just to have one date. What do I have to do?" "You can't afford a date with me," I assured him, although the wheels in my head were already turning. Money isn't an object. Living next to my grandma all these years, you have to know my family is loaded. He flashed me with his patented, arrogant grin that somehow managed to hold a certain magnetic charm. "Name it, and I'll do it. I'll make you understand how serious I am." He seemed so serious, and I thought maybe, just maybe, he could be the one I'd been searching for. And if he was, oh, I'd never dared dream. I grabbed a post-it note out and began scribbling the details on it as I told him what I wanted more than anything in the world. There is tea grown in the Fujian province of China called Hong Pao, or Big Red Robe as it translates. It grows high on the mountains and there's only a few select tea masters that are able to pick it. However, what many people don't know is that there are actually 2 strains of Hong Pao, the kind that is sold to the public and a rarer kind that is used in medicine and religious rituals. I glanced into his eyes, but they remained impassive. I dared to finish. "I want you to get it for me." He He smirked as though he was amused to my reticence. No problem. Is it expensive? I paused to consider that question. The tea itself? No. If you tell them how you need it, if you tell them I need it, they'll give it to you. Only you have to fly to China and get it yourself. They won't send it to you. They won't be able to find a trace of them outside their own little province. They're cut off from the world, and that's what makes their tea so special. Jamie paused as if to consider this, making a serious face and stroking his chin. Finally, he winked at me. Consider it done. My heart skipped a beat, all this time searching for the right person, and he'd been right next to me, waiting for me to notice him. Life seemed to move at a more glacial pace after that. Jamie bought tickets and set the date for 6 months after I gave him my request. During that half year, he studied Mandarin with a passion that I'd never seen in anyone else before. He also managed to track down all the Fujianese natives and began studying the dialect. He took very careful instruction from me as to how he could find these master tea pickers. The day before he left, he came to see me, glowing with confidence as though he had already succeeded in his quest. I knew that the worst was yet to come for him, but he didn't seem concerned. Before he walked out of my store, he stood in front of me and requested, no, demanded, a kiss for good luck. I was so excited and flustered that I leaned in to give him a peck on the lips without a second thought. He laughed at my blushing cheeks and walked out, anticipating a grand adventure. Weeks passed, several of them in fact, and not yet a word from Jamie. I tried to remind myself to be patient after all. He had to, 1, arrive in China, hike mountains, and then navigate his way to the secret property of the master pickers. Reaching them would take time, and that's not to mention gaining their trust. I could only hope that they would be a little bit more compliant when he mentioned my name. And then after a few more weeks, I noticed Miss Thompson was too preoccupied to harass me or scream racial obscenities towards me. She seemed shaken by Jamie's absence. Not that it surprised me. He was, after all, her primary caretaker. And though she could still manage on her own at this point, she always liked the company. I was beginning to think that I would never hear back from Jamie when, one morning, I arrived at the tea house to find a man sitting in the front of the shop. He was an elderly Chinese man wearing traditional garb. In his arm, he held a black lacquered chest. My heart stopped. When he saw me approach, he knelt in front of me and kowtowed 3 times. I inclined my head as a gesture of appreciation. Then, I opened the tea house and let him inside. We didn't exchange any words, although I am fluent in both Mandarin and Fujianese. Instead, I brewed him a cup of golden monkey black tea, which he drank for the ritual's sake. Once he was finished with his tea, he walked out the door and out of my life. But he left the chest behind. My hand shook as I lifted it, feeling its severe heft, and carried it down to the back room, locking the door and closing the blinds. I opened the chest. The first thing I saw were the bones. Each and every bone in Jamie's body sat in that chest, neatly packed into a solid mass. I took them out one at a time, spreading them all over my work table, admiring their pristine white color. I had never seen something so beautiful. Beneath the bones, separated by a wooden slot, was the tea, the small, dark green leaves with distinct golden flecks. That was how I knew they had given me the right product. The flashes of gold were the ticket. Yes, Jamie was the one I'd been waiting for, the one I needed, the bargaining chip that got me my most precious treasure. He was a perfect sacrifice. Miss Thompson changed after Jamie was officially declared missing. It was assumed that he had died in China hiking. An experienced hiker can easily go missing without the proper guide. And, just like that, she found herself alone in the world. Her other children and grandchildren would have nothing to do with her. She stopped screaming at me in the mornings. She stopped coming outside at all. But I just couldn't leave her alone like that. One morning, I brought a special tea over just for her. When I knocked on the door, I half expected her to cuss me out, shouting obscenities and misquoted Bible verses. Instead, she led me into her kitchen, and I brewed her tea. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. After a few minutes, she spoke on her own, about how Jamie had been so taken with me, sung my praises until she herself had begun to come around, about how much she had always loved him, and how her whole life had revolved around him ever since he had been born. She began crying at one point. In fact, she kept crying until I set her tea in front of her, at which point she absent-mindedly sipped the brew and gave me a surprised look. "This is good," I smiled at her. "It is, isn't it?" It only took a few days to get Miss Thompson to agree that I should be her new primary caretaker. Of course, she didn't need much care anymore, not after she began drinking my tea. After a few weeks, her forgetfulness, her signs of dementia, they began to fade. She was as sharp as she'd always been. Of course, that was intentional. I do, after all, Want her to live a nice, long life, full of memories of Jamie and the agony of never knowing what happened to him. It's amazing what a little tea with bone marrow in it can do to a person. As for me, well, I got what I wanted. I got the rare formula I need to get my tea healing powers. I got the sacrifice for those brews that require something darker, and without Miss Thompson's ranting and screaming, my mornings became much more peaceful.